Welcome to the Thoughtful Software Podcast. Innovate and thrive with thoughtful software. The hyper-personalization of technologies like machine learning and AI have forever changed the software landscape. As this technology grows, new innovations such as synthetic media, also known as deep faking, has potential to tailor the way media and technology are consumed by each individual. But as with any new technology, synthetic media can be exploited for unethical and potentially illegal reasons as well. Our guest today is Chris Dix, Head of Technology Transformation for Audience Products at the BBC. With a career spanning over 20 years in communications, broadcast, and media sectors, Chris is a proven leader in the media and entertainment industry, transforming ideas and technology into groundbreaking, next-generation solutions through a broader perspective supported by world-class talent. In this episode, Andrew and Fahad sit down with Chris to discuss these types of emerging tech, as well as how technology like this can be used ethically and responsibly to establish a culture of sustainable engineering. Here's Andrew, Fahad, and Chris.
All right, so Andrew and I have been looking forward to speaking with you, Chris. You're an innovative thinker and thought leader in media entertainment, so it seemed fitting to have you on and discuss technology in this space. And I'm sure we're going to cover a wide range of topics from emerging tech to maybe even sustainable engineering. You're all the way from one of my favorite cities, London. But how are you, Chris, today?
I'm good, and thanks for having me. It's gonna be an interesting conversation. Things are certainly changing. So I'm looking forward to talking through it.
That's fantastic. So let's start with just a broad look at the technology landscape in entertainment, just kind of where you see things and where things are today.
I think obviously over the last, I suppose it's sort of 5 to 10 years, things have sort of dramatically changed in terms of digital production, both in not just the sort of the video and audio space, but also even how we generate text-based content. I think we're starting to reassess the whole the end-to-end value chain. We're trying to understand how we get even more value out of our sort of production and distribution pipelines. I think we're talking a lot more about the value of metadata, the metadata that's generated from it, and how that can help innovate around things like new forms of consumption. We're seeing a lot around things like multimodal technology. We're seeing in the news, a lot of reporting around fake news and synthetic media. So I think there's a really good use case for things like synthetic media to provide certain scale and accessibility to content that probably wasn't as accessible before. So I think that's sort of generally what we're seeing, and we're seeing consumption methods change as well. So generally, audiences want to have the right to consume content in the way they want to consume it, and on the devices that they want to consume it on. So there's much more of a I think in the past you would effectively make an appointment to view content. The typical, like on your TV or a cable guide, like the EPG, you would typically make an appointment to view. I think it's now really moving from that, and it's taking content on demand.
So when you refer to synthetic media, you're referring to deep fakes and then the use of potentially deep faking technology to actually make good use of deep fake technology. For the listeners who don't know what deep fakes are, it's technology that uses AI and other techniques to basically create a very much likeness of somebody, and then throwing in audio, also using AI and other techniques to simulate their voice and everything. So it looks like the person is talking, it looks like them, and they can be extremely convincing, and occasionally state actors will use these to do psyops and things like that. Are we referring to the same tech, or are you referring to something else?
No, we're referring to the same tech. I mean, we spend a lot of time making sure that if we were to use this type of technology in anything that we did, it's done in a responsible and ethical manner. So it's important to enable audiences to certify that the content is real, as such, as real as it can be, but it's also represented in the sort of within a set of guidelines. I think that if you're if we're starting to get to that point of not just personalization, but hyper personalization of content, then you're going to need methods to dramatically scale more than we scale today. So it's going to have to be sort of context driven. It's going to be hyper personalized towards the things that you want to consume, where we may have a mix of content that's curated for you by humans, and then other mixed in with content that's curated using machine learning. So I think there's going to be a mix of that. So the use of that technology, there's lots of positives to using that technology if it's used responsibly and ethically. And I think some of the challenge is making sure that you find the right partners to work with to make sure that your responsibilities and ethical use of this is also backed by the technology suppliers that you're using in the same space.
Interesting. I think that when I think of legitimate uses of blockchain, besides selling JPEGs on the internet, the thing I'm most excited about is actually public ledgers that prove sources and prove legitimacy. And when I think about deepfakes being used in a positive way, which is something that I hadn't thought about ever, so you gave me a new rabbit hole to go down. Thank you for that. But now I'm thinking, how can you leverage a blockchain, a ledger, to go in and say, hey, I created this deepfake. This is a legitimate deepfake that we use to create content for you and all of our other contents on this blockchain to certify that this piece of content is legitimate. It's not, some state actor. This is true. This is verified. We put our stamp of approval on it. Do you think that that's something will happen, or do you think there's a different way to generate this public trust around this content, whether it's synthetic content or real content?
I think there's possibilities of sort of understanding the origin of the content. I think blockchain is one way of doing that. I suppose in the broadcast industry, there are other ways of signaling authenticity. We have in the past used things like watermarking in content, whether that's invisible watermarking as well, that can be picked up by players to sort of show how authentic the content is, where it originated from. Digital cinemas have been using it for years. So you can even certain origination technology there. You can if someone was to record like a feature film in a theater, you could play that back through decoders and understand which cinema screen it came through at what time of the day it was recorded. So there are a number of techniques. I quite like the blockchain approach. I must admit, I'm with you on that one. There are certainly ways in which we can leverage these technologies to show how authentic the content is. So to prove it's trustworthy, it's come from a trustworthy source. I think that's really important.
I absolutely agree, especially given the amount of distrust being bred in the media. And some of it's for good reason. Some of it's because of this exact, people photoshopping images. You go to like some subreddits and other sites on the internet, both on the both ends of the political spectrum. You can see where people are posting videos that are cut short. They're posting photoshopped images that look real, and the inability to verify that information is causing people to, one, absorb fake news, but on the other side of it, also distrust legitimate media when it is being produced. And so I think it's one of the largest struggles of our time as the internet has become completely prolific and adopted by the majority of the world. Social media doesn't help with that and everything else, because fake news spreads faster than legitimate news, unfortunately, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, when we sort of do technology evaluation, I've worked with partners in the past, and you can create a really good synthetic voice of an actor or something with less than 30 minutes worth of content. So it's it could be used for a lot of good things to scale content, but equally, as on the flip side, we need to put guidelines and checks in place to ensure that we know the authenticity, so we can trust it.
I've kind of jumped into blockchain. It's an emerging tech. There's 5G, AR, VR, AI, the subscription services, ad services, mobile, gaming. It just seems like it's a Herculean task for a media company to, evaluate all these different types of technologies. And it's just almost just sounds like a purely tech company. How do you approach all these various, new emerging technologies and applications that you can try? Like, how do you tackle this big challenge?
I think in some of the sort of bigger broadcasters, you're lucky to have R&D departments, and sort of innovation is baked into some of the sort of business as usual processes as well. So I think that you need to be prepared to make big bets. You also need to be prepared to fail fast, learn, and adapt. I think there are some tech that a lot of companies took on AR and VR very early, and maybe it's a bit too early. I do think that it's something that's going to come around and is going to be fundamental to the way that we consume content in the future. I mean, there are other areas, and we look back at 3D content in theaters years ago. Some early adopters, took hold of it. It was a little bit too early. It was something that was made very accessible to all filmmakers. And if it's not done very well, you've basically got people walking out the cinema feeling unwell. So I think you've got to be prepared to not just make that single bet. It's a case of you're going to innovate, be prepared to fail fast, learn, adapt, and go back through that cycle, and just start to see where the value is on that. But there's the approach I like to take is to sort of understand what are the future technical capabilities that we might need in the future, but then look at ways of assembling those capabilities into new propositions, rather than trying to think of a new technology and how do we generate like a full stack implementation of that technology. Let's actually look at the technical capabilities that we might need and ensuring that they are agile enough to be assembled so that we can create things very quickly, which also helps to limit the amount of investment that you have to make while innovating.
Interesting. So let's use a concrete real world thing that's going to affect you and the media industry. So NFTs, and I'm sure you know this by now, are absolutely bonkers at the moment. Whether they stay absolutely bonkers, I don't know, but it does seem like that this is the first time that the digital world has come up with an intersection, and in this case, the intersection between finance and art. And art's been around for all of humanity. Finance has been around just as long. And so this is two massive things coinciding together. When you see something like this happening, where the onset of NFTs happened seemingly overnight and has been ramping over the last 6 months, whether that's because people got bored during COVID or legitimate technological advances, I don't think it's a bit of B in my opinion, but when you think about that, how do you adjust your strategy to, you said move fast, agile, I like that, but when you're thinking about how do I bring this in, how do I evaluate this? How do I know it's part of our strategy? And how do I adapt today, knowing that it's an incredibly hot opportunity potentially for you to make a huge win?
I think first of all, I don't think the tech should define your use case. I think it's a case of looking at how a particular technology could bring value to audiences, and sort of what are the opportunities in that space, and then to start evaluating, in terms of what does the market capability look like around that technology. How advanced is it? Is it something that we should just be watching? Is it something that we should be building ourselves? Should we be working with partners, or even look at acquiring companies? And I think that those sort of emerging technologies, first of all, we need to understand what is our play in this space. How does it fit with our future strategies? How does it impact the rest of the business? Can it generate commercial revenue? and then start to see, actually, it could do all these. We could think about this type of technology for all of these types of use cases that bring value, whether it's commercial value, audience value, or even optimization within workflow. But we need to be quite cautious in terms of the maturity of that technology. And we've done a lot. I've done a lot of work in the last few years around voice technology. So bringing natural language into the business. It's all well and good saying, okay, we're going to bring natural language into the business. It's going to help us do X, Y, Z. But there are other things to consider. We did a sort of a market evaluation of technical capabilities before we made any decisions. But even taking something like voice capabilities into a business, the other things that you're going to need, the other things that impact your business, for instance, is how we treat personal data. Natural language is one of the new forms of personal data that needs to be interpreted. We need to be able to store it and treat it properly in order to help improve products. But it's, you've got to have the expertise and the understanding to make sure that when these technologies impact your business, they positively impact your business, and that we use them appropriately and responsibly and ethically as well. So it's very easy to jump onto new tech very quickly, but I think the right due diligence needs to be applied to how those technologies might be used and what are the impacts on those technologies in other aspects of things, like personal data, as I mentioned.
I had a question around, there's a lot of things that are changing on us, especially now with COVID. How has your view of maybe just the infrastructure, data, or just deploying these technologies changed with, COVID and just moving forward? How are you looking at things, for the next year? Maybe just how you adopt technologies. Anything changed because of that?
I think as terrible as COVID was for all of us, I think what it's really done is accelerated the approach that we were always going to take. I think that a lot of companies had already moved to remote or hybrid working. We know the tools out there to support these types of activities already existed, and they've now been tested at scale. So from a business perspective, I think it's making businesses even more inclusive, and companies then actually have access to a much broader and diverse talent pool. So on that side, I think that on the on the side of our sort of customers and audiences, I think, as I said earlier, the sort of appointment to view sort of mentality around content is probably changing. I think people are more sort of content is more on demand now. You're starting to see sort of like cable providers starting to aggregate the likes of Netflix, Amazon, and those sorts of services all in one place. So I think that I think that we were probably always going to end up in this way of working and way of consuming content. But I think what this pandemic has done for us is actually just accelerated us to that point, is what I've noticed.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting shifts too, like in especially in your industry around like remote production, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily from a specific studio where you're broadcasting. It could be now everywhere. A broadcaster could be in their living room or in their home office, doing a report, and that's something I see staying for a long time. I'm not sure if it does, but technologically, that seems like a pretty challenging task to just now deploy a remote workforce. I feel like that's one of those things that I find interesting about what changed.
I think companies were always going to be nervous about doing it, but we were forced to do it. So I've been chatting to companies who are bringing different solutions to market. So you can basically do production in the cloud. You're certainly seeing some of the impacts on businesses that were largely working on-prem, where you would have things like edit suites would be physical within offices. and those sorts of things. So when you're, working on very sort of expensive premises, you may be limited to the number of, the amount of work that you could do. Now that we've tested remote production at scale, I think businesses have the opportunity to scale even further because they don't need to be in the same place. And as I said earlier, they have access to a greater pool of resources as well. So you think that, businesses used to operate on a you always work on sort of an OPEX. CapEx was all of your equipment, and OPEX was, all of your operational running costs. If you look at business and operating models now, is that there's less and less capital expenditure, because it's, as we start moving process to the cloud, it's more about operational expenditure. So you're near enough, even if you're working with a contractor for X number of hours, it's all about consumption. So I basically use the compute time in the cloud, as well as the amount of time I'm working with the individual. So I think that, the need for those sort of plush premises, business premises that we used to have, will be used for, really important activities, such as finishing projects with customers and those sorts of things. But everything else can probably be done remotely. And there's some great companies out there who are dealing with, really important issues like low latency, file transfer of, production quality content. And that stuff only becomes even harder when we go to 4K, 8K, and those sorts of things. So there's a huge amount of progress in terms of how we do things like remote production, and even the pressure that has been put on CDNs as well, so content distribution networks. You're seeing peaks in streaming because they are at home. So there's been a huge amount of testing on the ability for our networks to cope with, this new way of working. And I think it's broadly been quite successful.
Yeah, I noticed a real difference. But do you see with remote production that the industry would fully adopt cloud, or still kind of maintain more of a hybrid approach? Because you're describing a lot of technology, technical challenges in delivering this high quality 4K and 8K, distributed across.
Yeah, I'm lucky to work with a couple of startups, and I am seeing I'm seeing there is a lot of talk about hybrid. There's a lot of companies who have still significant investments in equipment that they own. So it's not always, possible just to switch things off and move to the cloud. There's still depreciation of equipment and those things to think about. So it's not a case of switch it off and start again. You don't have those luxuries. And I think that with, there are probably still concerns over privacy, especially if we're dealing with a high value content. Also just trying to get things like file movements, get that right. It's all well and good putting all of our content into the cloud, but there's still that cost of egress. So bringing it down when we need to bring it down. Egress costs, I think, are probably not economical as yet. So I think the move to a hybrid configuration, I think, is probably the optimal way of progressing at the minute.
Interesting. So on this side, once you have this hybrid thing approach, there's still one key problem I think even Netflix struggles with, which is discoverability. And it seems like that's the thing that is probably top of mind for everybody. We're creating petabytes of content potentially every week. And that just means that discoverability gets more and more important. And how do you think about discoverability? How do you ensure that your customers and your consumers are seeing the content that they should see and helping them discover new things that they might be interested in, knowing that it's pretty hard to parse video, get text out of voice, and all those other challenges that come in natively to this problem of discoverability?
I think a lot of the data that we have about content at the moment is quite flat. It's quite single dimensional, and using sort of machine learning principles and concepts, what we can do is we can start to extract knowledge out of content, so that we can organize that content in such a way that we can even, it's like creating a knowledge graph. where we've got all of our content, that we've got knowledge that's been extracted, it's organized and connected in the right way. And we can do a lot of that through the production process. But it's all well and good generating all this knowledge, but if it's just, like we used to say years ago, left on the cutting room floor and not taking further up the value chain, then it's all well and good as having the information, but if we don't use it properly, then it's no good to anybody. So in order for it to be discoverable, we need to not only consume the quite sort of flat metadata that we have today, such as things like title, genre, actors, that sort of thing, production years, that sort of stuff, which is more things we typically see on our IMDb. There's lots of other data in there as well that we might be able to benefit from, especially when that data is then connected. I mean, we might look at things today such as recommendation engines. We build those to help recommend, you watch this, so you might like this. But if we want to explore other types of content as well, like documentaries and, let's say, text-based content that could be synthetically generated into audio and video representations of that, I think that there's a different way of discovering content, but being able to use knowledge that's extracted to go very deep and broad across certain topics or domains of information. And I think that's going to be those sort of concepts will be quite generic across things like news and sport and education, as well as short form and long form typical video and audio content.
Interesting. One of the ideas I have for a startup, I have a lot of ideas, so I write them down in my journal, but one of them that I really find myself going back to often is, a few years ago, and by a few, I mean a long time ago, the Pandora Music Project started, and the idea was that they were going to create a genome for music and be able to give recommendations. And clearly that changed the course of the way Spotify works and Apple Music and all these streaming services work, because of the prolific way they index the information within music. And I think there's nothing that exists for that for cinema or media in terms of like video media. And I wonder if someone will probably try to do that in the next 5 to 10 years, especially given that it's easier to consume a 3-minute song than it is to watch an hour-long special and be able to recommend it. And so I think, when I think about what you just said, I think, man, that we're a long way away from something like that happening. But when it does, it's going to be transformative. When that huge knowledge graph, that really rich nodes are created about media, and it'll be disruptive, but it'll also be an exciting time for people.
Yeah, but again, another thing that I think it's another one of those things that we need to be proactive about, because if it's not something that we do as a community, it gets done to us through some of the big tech companies. And I think that we need to make sure that we're aligned in terms of how we might use this information, making sure that any sort of knowledge graph or content graph that we present is firstly an acceptable view of the world, which content can be attached to. So I think we've also got to have our wits about how we do this as well, especially if it's going to be very much a shared set of knowledge. If it's going to be more of a marketplace where knowledge can be attached to, I think there's some good opportunities there. And we talk about disruptive things and the way in which audiences want content in the future. And I think one of the things that we'll use metadata for is to automatically create different versions of content. So if you think of a long form piece of content that may be, let's say, 60 minutes long, and you actually say, I've only got 25 minutes, give me a version that's gonna be insightful, it's gonna be relative and relatable to the things that I like, and give me that version of it. So I think content is going to have to be flexible and more accessible. So it may be the fact that, okay, I have some short form video, but actually I'm traveling in my car and I want to listen to that in my car. So I can't watch it, I might listen to it. And then I might want to read the transcript of it later. So content is going to have to be much more flexible. And also, if I choose to, I might choose to consume content on one device, but how about if I want to consume it across multiple devices simultaneously? And there are some amazing opportunities out there, especially in things like education, and TV. So content becomes more flexible and participative as well. So there's much more sort of integration. Ways of interacting with content is going to be interesting, and it's going to be, people are going to demand it.
Yeah, I find one thing interesting too, so something that I think Netflix did with supplementing the recommendation engine with just a simple top 10 list, right? It's just, it's old school, it works. What are the top shows on the platform? And, because I think there's also this trend of people wanting the option of opting out of algorithms and recommendations. So what you're describing is just like this multi-mode of, how do you want to consume content? How do you want to get this content? What do you want us to recommend? If you even want us to recommend anything, and here's just like everything, and now you pick. It's kind of like an a la carte. So I find that really fascinating as well.
Yeah, I think there is that mix. Just to your point, there is that mix of having that human crafted or curated set of recommendations like your top 10, but then followed up with machine driven recommendations also. I think having that hybrid, or that hybrid approach to providing those is important, because there may be, using a set of recommendations may give you things that we know about, the things that you like, but we don't know about the things that you haven't quite discovered yet, that may not be within the same category of things. So I think having that mix of sort of human curated recommendations or content recommendations along with machine driven recommendations is going to be important, because if not, we end up just circling around the same old things that we think we like, and we don't discover the things that we haven't decided that we like yet.
One of the other topics that I wanted to cover was around sustainable engineering and the environmental impact of all these technologies that we're talking about. And BBC is doing like just some tremendous work in this area, and leading the industry and bringing everyone together to discuss how all this impacts our environment and the carbon footprint. What are your thoughts on how, this industry is moving towards just more neutrality in this area? And what are the other things that the industry could do? I wish Bitcoin would do something about it, but it doesn't seem like they are. But just your thoughts on that area.
It's not an immediate focus point for me. I think the key thing at the moment is we have to be aware, and we have to have a plan. The BBC has a set of targets and has a plan, and I think that's our responsibility to sort of try to lead the way on that, and to educate others, and for people to understand the impacts of making these changes, what they are, and how they do affect the environment. So I think it's the more and more we're changing our ways of working, we're going to need to be mindful. We're going to have to stay educated and understand the impact of making these jumps to remote production. All of a sudden, we're spinning up hundreds of GPUs in the cloud and consuming huge amounts of compute so that we can render content quickly, efficiently, and get it out the door quicker. But there's always an impact of doing that. So we have to be mindful of the impacts of our behavior as we change our working practices, and how that will affect sustainability. And I think that it's also the responsibilities of the big tech companies who provide this compute to us, to work with us, and to make sure that we are sort of equally mindful together, sort of in partnership, of like how we change our working practices, and how do we ensure that our workflows and our processes are still helping us work towards those important sustainability targets.
Yeah, I find this really fascinating. It's great to hear, because just the general thesis of what this podcast has always been about is thoughtful software and thoughtful technology, and being very mindful about privacy and environment. So it's great to hear that it's being reviewed and looked at, and BBC is definitely leading that. As we kind of wrap up our conversation, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on the future of technology in the entertainment space, maybe in the next 5 years. What interesting new customer behaviors or emerging standards that you see that we haven't covered, that you think will be impactful and important coming up here?
I think there's a couple of bits I mentioned earlier. So content and the flexibility of content. Content's going to need to be more flexible and accessible. There's a concept that I've been working on for some time, which is called polymorphic content. So that is starting to consider how content is designed so it can work across individual modalities, but also work across multiple modalities simultaneously. So I think that there will be emerging standards around how we create content in that way, so that as you create these types of sort of interactive and flexible content formats, they also need to be portable across different platforms and ecosystems. So that's going to be I feel that's going to be important. We also talked about synthetic media, so the use of using machine learning to let's say mimic someone's voice or create synthetic video. I think they will be important, but they're also potentially quite dangerous. So we have to make sure that these technologies are used responsibly. We talk a lot about personalization, but we don't think we've really made that jump to hyper-personalization. And I think that's another way in which content will have to adapt. So we may be, as we talked earlier, there may be different versions of content based on the amount of time I have or the device that I'm using. I think that's going to be key. And also one of the real emerging technologies that's really accelerating is around voice assistance and being able to use natural language to command things. So at the moment, and it's a subject that I'm quite involved in at the moment. Today where we are, we have natural language for command and control activities, such as turn the lights on, order me something from the shops, or order me an Uber or something else. But as that technology progresses, we're starting to move into much deeper conversational design. So we'll be having multi-turn conversations. We'll start to think about the conversational history that we had before, and how do we use that type of technology on top of things like, we talked about, a content graph, understanding where our content is, how it's connected. So using a layer of a set of knowledge that we have, in conjunction with using natural language to query the knowledge that we have in the most natural way that we know, and also being able to then present that content back in a flexible manner. I think they are sort of the three pillars of disruption, I think. So flexible media, natural language, and content knowledge and discovery are going to those sort of three pillars of disruption. Those three pillars should progress and underpin things like AR and VR as the price point for those things becomes more accessible. I think those capabilities need to be taken into account to progress into that space as well. I think that's where I think things will go, and things are important because content is also going to have to be really interactive as well. Hence the conversational aspect of flexible content.
I was curious on your opinion on social viewing. It seems like it's like the 3D movie moment where, you want to watch Netflix together with your friends. I just don't see it. But I was just curious on your opinion on if that's going to work or not.
Do you know what? That's something I should have mentioned. It's something that we've been talking about for some time. Well, certainly over the last 12 months, we've been thinking about it. And there is these different, it's like this slider of personalization. You've got personalization as we know it today, which is more recommendation, I suppose. Then you walk towards hyper-personalization, which is still about the individual. And then you've got this group personalization, where actually it's really important to create these like group profiles where you can start to have this sort of social viewing and social interaction, but also being equally aware that doesn't impact on your own personal preferences. So it's like when you're maybe sitting down with the family and watching some content that contributes towards your social consumption, but then you've still got your own personal consumption. So it's a really interesting mix about how do you keep those things separate. But I think that sort of group personalization is going to be really important. We've been talking about some of this in terms of thinking about how does in-car work. In-car is a really interesting sandbox, really, where I might start the journey on my own, but then other people start to join me on my journey, and how does that change? Are we listening to a podcast together of when maybe Andrew leaves the car, and then I go back to my own my own preferences. When Andrew joins me back in the car, do we resume a podcast that we were listening to together? So the in-car environment, I think, is a really interesting sandbox for different types of personalization and content participation and interaction. I think that's going to be a really interesting moment. Yeah, there's nothing worse than jumping onto one of your favorite sort of video stores, online video stores and such, and somebody has used your profile. So let's say my daughter's used my profile. All of a sudden, there's all this stuff that comes up that I could think of nothing worse than clicking on. So then there's that, and you wouldn't want that sort of behavior to, I suppose, change the way in which you consume content on your own. But the group personalization is equally quite important. So when we sit down together and we consume content together, whether that's in the same room or in different locations, I think that's going to be another key thing that's going to be really interesting to see how that develops.
I think that's great. I think you should get the last word, Chris. That was really cool.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode and the show in general. Drop in your thoughts by leaving us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Connect with us at skiplist.com for more content like this.